Natural farming has played a role in my gardening practice since I started growing intensively 5 years ago. And if there is one thing that you can expect when you bring up Korean natural farming or JADAM, it's opinionated growers with opinionated opinions. So I thought it would be helpful to do a hopefully very sober-minded side-by-side comparison of these two frameworks, their similarities and differences, strengths and limitations, as well as a few warnings and practical framework for how you might consider incorporating or expanding your horizon when it comes to these two incredible methods of agriculture. First, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I'm Taylor and I help gardeners grow in more sustainable and regenerative ways, oftentimes, hopefully, in ways that you haven't considered. And today we're talking about two of the most impactful frameworks for growing that changed everything about the way that I garden and the way that I help others in their practice. In case you haven't heard of these, or maybe you've heard of one but not the other, both KNF and JADAM offer an approach to growing that focuses on curating the biology on the plants and in the soil, rather than the typical or the conventional approaches that often only focus on the chemistry at play when we're growing plants. Korean natural farming was researched and developed through the 1950s and 60s by a Korean farmer named Han Kyu Cho, and in the early 21st century, his son Young-sung Cho built on his father's teachings to develop his own adjacent framework, JADAM organic farming. The main and most prominent similarity that I see between the two, and probably the most important, is their commitment to the usage of acronyms. I've counted nearly 30 acronyms between the two systems, and it gets a little overwhelming at times. So in this video, I'll try to refer to everything by its non-abbreviated name, with the exception of KNF, which of course stands for Korean Natural Farming. Another almost equally substantial similarity between KNF and JADAM are their cultivation and the usage of indigenous microorganisms. And this is honestly one of the most elegant and important contributions of natural farming, and one that deserves a lot more scientific research because of how substantial the results are and the potential is for modern growers. At present, all I can reference is my personal experience using indigenous microorganisms in both frameworks, but I highly encourage you to experiment yourself. The essence of indigenous microorganism theory is that we're taking the best of what nature has produced and we're bringing it into our gardens. In case you weren't aware, microorganisms are involved in just about every process within the soil and in a plant's own biology. They facilitate growth at every level and as such can be considered an essential component of any gardening operation. Many, myself included, actually believe that curating microbial life in the soil is probably the most important thing you can do as a gardener. And so when we collect, culture, and apply the microbes from nature, where everything just kind of runs and thrives all on its own without any help from people, we're bringing in a lot of resilience, strength, and diversity to our gardens. We're helping them align themselves with nature more fully. And both JADAM and KNF build their frameworks on that foundation. Another similarity between these two frameworks is their emphasis on lowering the cost of inputs and reducing reliance on external resources. The subtitle of the JADAM Organic Farming book is The Way to Ultra Low Cost Agriculture. A big component of lowering the costs is that KNF and JADAM systems largely center around homemade gardening inputs and the overall DIY approach. We'll get into specifics here, but all of the inputs, in theory, can be collected or made either on site or nearby, wherever you are growing, with a few exceptions. Both JADAM and KNF are fairly scalable in my experience because of the way that homemade inputs are utilized. A little really goes a long way, meaning that you make the input once per season or even once per decade in some cases. Of course, there's variation here, and some inputs are more time and labor intensive than others. But overall, these systems are designed to slot into conventional agricultural practices. Probably the main difference that gets JADAM and KNF apart from the conventional approaches, though, is rather than taking a heavy-handed, highly involved approach to growing, both frameworks at least attempt to take a step back and appreciate the natural processes that are at work apart from human intervention. And this manifests in the acceptance of nutritive cycle theory. Really simply put, nutritive cycle theory is the idea that a plant and an animal, for that matter, have different nutritional requirements and preferences at different stages within their life cycle. So rather than a consistent set of nutrients and growth stimulants, each relies on flexible and adaptive treatment. So during the early stages of a plant growth, when a plant's main goal is to increase its biomass so that it can photosynthesize more and beef itself out, certain inputs are applied that help with nitrogen absorption and stimulate leaf production. Later on in a plant's growth cycle, however, more calcium might be required, and natural pest defense systems might need to be activated, which dictate a different set of nutrients and compounds for application. The system is baked into the overarching philosophy of KNF and JADAM, which is biomimicry, copying and facilitating natural processes organically rather than forcing results at specific optimal times. Finally, the main similarity that I see between each iteration of natural farming is that neither encourage repeated tillage. Since nature relies on microorganisms for generating appropriate soil health, the need for mechanical tillage goes away. Let me know in the comments if you see any other similarities between KNF and JADAM that I missed. I'm certainly not the grand representative of either of these frameworks, and this is just my opinion at the end of the day. While there are a lot of similarities between each system, there are also a fair number of differences between KNF and JADAM. And while both share very similar philosophy that results in similar practices, there are three key distinctions between each system, again, that I see. Firstly, whereas KNF has quite a few different inputs that are used in various ways and at various times and in various contexts, it seems like one of Young-Sung Cho's primary goals for JADAM was to simplify. Within KNF, there are 9 categories of inputs plus various application schedules, combinations, and variations on each input's usage. In JADAM, there are 5 core recipes to learn, one of which can open up into a variety of iterations, and one of which, the microbial solution, allows you to turn it into a shelf-stable form of itself. Now, there is also an entire extra book devoted to the pest management research that Young-Sung Cho did in order to find natural, helpful remedies for fungal disease and pest damage, but in theory, only a few of those are going to be needed for each grower, since pests and diseases are going to be highly location dependent. And this simplified approach is by design. Young-Sung Cho explicitly calls out his father's system as a bit overly complicated, and it seems to even potentially annoy him a little bit. Could be wrong there. The main area of simplification within JADAM, however, is in the way that it treats indigenous microbes, which brings us to the second and what I would consider the main core difference between each framework. To get into this, we need to actually understand how and where indigenous microorganisms exist. Microbes can be found on pretty much any surface in any part of the world, underwater, floating in the air, covering our skin, inside plant and animal bodies. But if we're going to find microbes that will most benefit our gardens and fields, we need to look in areas where the soil has been left undisturbed and protected for long amounts of time. Now, one of the easiest ways to find these undisturbed microbes is by following this 3-step process. Number 1, find a thick-trunked tree. Step number 2, scrape away the leaf litter below said tree. And step number 3, look for white strands of mycelium. This is your generally reliable evidence that the soil that you're looking at contains robust microbes that have learned how to live season to season through the hot and the cold, the rain and the drought in that specific area. Now also, generally speaking, if that tree happens to be growing in a higher elevation, it's possible that those soil microbes that are facilitating and sustaining the growth of the tree are going to be even a little bit stronger and more adapted to the general locale. Now in JADAM, we're simply taught to collect leaf mold soil, the soil underneath the tree's leaf litter, and then either to culture that soil through a simple process or to use it as a culture for other ingredients in various ways. And I've provided recipes that you can download for both of these processes linked in the description, so feel free to check those out and follow along. Here's what the JADAM approach looks like. For the microbial solution, we take the leaf mold soil, boil some potato, cool it down so it doesn't burn any of the microbes in the soil, and then we strain the cooked potato and soil through a fine mesh bag or cheesecloth or burlap into dechlorinated water. The potato is going to provide an easily digestible food source for the microbes in the leaf mold soil, and then for good measure, and because nobody likes their food unseasoned, we add a large pinch of unrefined, non-iodized sea salt to the brew. Let the microbes have their dinner. We watch as they start to multiply in number and in activity in the water. So once the foam is at its peak, that solution is ready to use, and it can be used for a variety of purposes, but the main ones being a soil drench or as a foliar application for plants. What this gives us is the microbes from the forest in a potent form that will go down into the soil and perform all of the functions they were performing back in the forest, but in your garden. And the key thing here, and this really matters for our discussion, is that the type of organism that we're getting, the two main microbes we're trying to culture for good soil health are bacteria and fungi. Now these are very broad categories of microbes, but essentially the role bacteria are going to play is fast-paced and short-lived, whereas fungi are hopefully going to take a while to get established, but last forever if left undisturbed. Bacteria is sort of like a road work crew, and the fungi are like the road, right? The crew comes in quick and only lasts a few days. Maybe that's a bad analogy, actually, but maybe you get what I'm saying. Bacteria come and go. It's not like they aren't important, they're essential, and the JADAM microbial solution provides really strong bacteria that do serious work for your soil and your plants. However, if we're going to capture and culture the long-lasting fungal microbes from the woods, we got to turn to Korean natural farming. And if you're unfamiliar with this process, please don't let it scare you off. It's more doable than it seems. Instead of removing leaf mold soil from the forest, we're going to take a little more subtle approach. To collect these fungal cultures, we're going to bring the meal to them, so to speak. And the most commonly used food source comes in the form of white rice. But I've come to find that white rice is very hit and miss for me in my climate. The fungi in my extremely dry and arid climate seem to enjoy something that holds onto a bit more moisture, like pearl barley or whole oats. And so to entice the microbes, we're going to place the grains in a box after they've been cooked, this time unseasoned. We'll save that for later. And then we'll put the box on the forest floor underneath the leaf litter, and it's just going to stay there for a few days, depending on how warm things get while it's out there. But once we return, we should find that the indigenous microorganisms have begun their feast at that point, and we're ready to take these guys home. Now, if we wanted to spread that moldy rice on our soil, we would get a nice dose of indigenous bacteria, maybe some protozoa and nematodes in there as well, similar to the JADAM microbial solution. But if we want to introduce the fungi, we can't jump to third base quite yet. Fungi requires us to go on a few more dates. And those dates are like preserving the microbes in brown sugar, feeding those microbes a new substrate like oats or wheat bran, and then gradually introducing them to our native garden soil microbes. This gradual integration is what is going to establish the long-term committed relationship between our garden's soil microbes and nature's microbes. And you can check out our videos detailing the process a bit more in depth if you want to get started yourself, or you can download the beginner's guide to IMO, linked in the description. But to back up and to remember why we're here in the first place, this is probably the main difference that many people will point to between the KNF systems and the JADAM system of inputs. And it's something that people really get up in arms about. I've seen people defend both sides of the fence on this one, and I've got a few thoughts of my own that we'll get into when we talk about my recommendations for you. One final distinction here when it comes to the uses of each of these microbial cultures. In JADAM, Youngsung Cho encourages using the leaf mold soil as an all-purpose inoculant for breaking down organic matter and minerals into bioavailable nutrients for plants. In the book, he details a simple process, for instance, of making a mineral-rich water by feeding the leaf mold soil rocks in water. So over time, the microbes in the leaf mold soil will acidify and break down these rocks into more plant-available minerals within the water. He also uses leaf mold soil as the culture that breaks down plant debris and food scraps, manure, eggshells, and more, all in water. That's the way everything decomposes in JADAM. In KNF, we really have three approaches to this kind of preparation of materials, none of which traditionally use the indigenous microorganisms. Instead, for plant debris and fish waste, we use brown sugar to gently extract nutrients and enzymes. For specific herbal extracts, we use a high alcohol content spirit like vodka. And for mineral supplements, we use a high-quality vinegar extraction process. This results in a range of solutions that all enter the soil and the plants in the soil in different ways, sort of rounding out the edges of the IMO culture that is the primary garden inoculant. At least that's the way I see it. This is definitely interesting because vinegar, specifically when applied at very low doses, produces a type of mild stress response within a plant that signals certain plant defense systems to come online without harming the plant. Alcohol, in the case of the herbal extracts, administers the nutrients in slightly different ways and crosses cellular barriers in ways distinct from how a fermented plant juice, for instance, made from osmotic pressure extracted enzymes would treat the same plant. If that last part didn't really make much sense, don't worry about it. Basically, KNF uses a variety of different substances to create its inputs whereas JADAM relies almost solely on leaf mold soil for its fermented inputs. The third difference that I see between KNF and JADAM is an interesting one, but relevant, and that is, with the exception of maybe seawater, all of the inputs in KNF are supposedly edible at their recommended homeopathic level dilution rates. I'm not encouraging you to consume them necessarily, and please don't drink them undiluted, but practitioners will tell you that all of them are edible and even beneficial for human consumption. On the flip side, when it comes to JADAM, we're not dealing with inputs that are harmful to human health exactly, but none of them are considered edible. And if you have ever made JADAM liquid fertilizer, you probably know why. Now, with the primary similarities and differences out of the way, let's hop into some of the strengths of both of these systems, starting with JADAM. As someone who primarily utilizes KNF inputs for their growing, I love JADAM. And the main reason for that is that it's easy to start. It's pretty straightforward as far as natural farming approaches go, and it's also decently well documented. In the book, Young-Sung Cho provides nutrient analyses of various amendments. He's received organic certification for each of the inputs, and he's gone to great lengths to record the results that he and many others practicing his techniques have achieved, especially in South Korea. The reason it's so easy to start is because it's a pretty low stakes operation. Collecting leaf mold soil and brewing up some microbial solution doesn't take that much effort, honestly, and that's probably kind of the 80-20, the 20% of the system that gets you 80% of the results. As far as KNF, I think its strengths lie in its long-lasting inputs on soil health, its nuance, and its adaptability. There are definitely several parts of the system that could be a bit more flexible, but all in all, KNF encourages you to experiment with a wider suite of inputs that allows for more variation and adaptability based on individual growers' growing needs. On top of this, the patient and gentle approach to indigenous microorganism cultivation is incredibly impressive, and a lot of work went into figuring out the best practices here. There's so much promise when it comes to using this ideology and practice to restore ecology on farms and home gardens. And the overarching long-term goal for KNF's IMO integration is that the soil gets brought back to a place where proper nutrient cycling is happening all on its own without much help from us gardeners. Now, while there are many strengths to each of these approaches, I want to be honest about what I see as the limiting factors for both, because there definitely are some significant ones. And starting with JADAM, perhaps the most upsetting limitation comes in the form of the foul odors generated when producing these inputs, specifically the JADAM liquid fertilizer and the JADAM sulfur. The fertilizer smells like something between really bad breath, like someone hasn't brushed their teeth in several years, and sewage runoff. And sulfur smells like sulfur. It's not pleasant, and I know Young-Sung Cho has recommended for how to reduce these odors, but these inputs in particular give off quite a stench, and that can be a hurdle for someone trying to stay friends with their neighbors. Another limitation is when it comes to the wetting agent and the JADAM sulfur recipes. I think many home gardeners will find them unapproachable. I know I did for quite a while, and it's totally possible that I will use these more in the future, but I think that for a lot of home gardeners, again, these might be a bit too high of a hurdle to jump over. Lastly, as we've already discussed, the microbial solution is an amazing input and very easy to make. And this isn't really a drawback as much as it is just an actual limiting factor, but compared to IMO stage 4, the lasting microbial and especially fungal diversity is not something that's going to stick around long term. It just requires you to keep making it for it to do its thing. Of course, your soil health will stay good over time and your soil overall will be blessed by applying the JADAM microbial solution, but it's not really a one-for-one replacement of IMO. Speaking of IMO, when I think about the limitations of Korean natural farming, I do consider IMO pretty difficult for beginners to get on board with. It took me a lot of persistence trying to figure this thing out from stage 1 through stage 4. It's one of the main things that I try to help people with in our natural gardening group membership. And so I think it's a bit of a limitation within the framework. Similarly, there are some other inputs within KNF that can be relatively time and resource intensive. Oriental herbal nutrient, for example, is a 2.5-month process to make and costs a bit to get all the materials together. Fermented fish amino acids isn't exactly hard to make, but it can take a while to get things fully broken down and ready to use. So I think there's a bit of a limitation there. Now, aside from the limitations of JADAM and KNF, I have a few warnings to offer as you are considering going down this path, or perhaps you already have traveled for a while and are experimenting with some of these things, the main warning I want to give is against dogmatism. Whether that's listening to people who speak with extreme confidence and authority on the topic, or just taking a narrow-minded position yourself. People love to poo-poo JADAM and call it a shortcut that doesn't actually do anything. Others are going to swear their allegiance to JADAM and say it's the exact same, only easier than KNF, and people collecting IMO are just wasting their time. And the fact is that with pretty much anything in life, these are not black and white frameworks. What a lot of people are worried about, I think, is that growers will only partially try out the techniques and then claim that they don't work. And that's valid, and I would encourage you to actually try to learn the techniques the way that they are being taught, not just doing something similar and calling it JADAM or KNF. At the same time, these are frameworks. They're meant to be adapted and changed based on your own specific context and experience. Along with that, another warning I want to give is to not fear making mistakes when trying either of these frameworks out. These are really unique ways of growing. They're not exactly intuitive, and it takes a little time to wrap your brain around what's all happening in each framework. An encouragement I'd offer is to try something from these if you haven't already. We've got a lot of resources on this channel. You can check out our JADAM and KNF playlist to get you started, but the main point here is that while it can feel overwhelming to make your first batch of JMS, for instance, or to put a box of cooked rice in the forest, you can only wait so long. Try to actually overcome your apprehension by trying something. And so with that, I'll start to conclude this video with a few recommendations on where you might want to start that journey. If you have never gone into the forest with the intention of collecting indigenous microorganisms, maybe just start by finding a healthy area in nature, in the general area that you're growing in, looking for mycelium and taking a few handfuls of the soil from that spot. Try making a microbial solution with the potato and salt. Try making one of the stinky weed teas by tossing in leaf mold soil in a bucket with water and plant debris. This is a great place to start. If you have already done these and maybe you've sworn your allegiance to JADAM while giving up on KNF, consider if you would try placing a box of rice or another cooked grain in your leaf mold collection spot. A really great way to practice collecting IMO is even just to try collecting microbes from your own property. You can just put one of these collection boxes or baskets into your compost bay and cover it with leaves. If you don't have a compost bay, you can create the conditions for microbes to develop by even just making a pile of leaves or grass clippings and watering it every few days for a week or two. Then just look underneath the pile and you'll likely see some sort of white fungi or actinobacteria. Try placing a collection box there and seeing what you can get. This is a more beginner-friendly approach than tromping out into the forest for a hit or miss collection when you've never done it before. Another thing that you could try to kind of warm yourself up to making an IMO 3 pile, try making a shelf-stable JADAM microbial solution. This is made in virtually identical way to IMO 3. You can check out our 3 easy upgrades to JMS video if you want to learn how to do that. Point is, wherever you're at in exploring these techniques, there's somewhere along the path that you can hop in. Another recommendation I would personally give is to consider your goals for your garden and take stock of your limiting beliefs. A limiting belief, for instance, is that certain plants just always get powdery mildew, or your soil is just too sandy or too clay or lacking in organic matter or just generally inhospitable. When you can identify a limiting belief, you can create a plan for how to actually address that and course correct. Soil can be repaired. Plant disease is avoidable. It may not happen immediately. Usually I'm kind of looking for a quick fix, while the actual answer is that it takes a few years. But we can't make a plan if we don't know the problem that we're trying to solve. Same thing for our gardens. Is your goal a huge fruit farm, but your crops are plagued by disease? Then it actually might make sense for you to make a JADAM sulfur solution. Are you super happy and content with your patio garden? Probably not a great investment to go and make a bunch of sulfur, but you probably would benefit from some of the low-key inputs from KNF, and even maybe trying to catch a little bit of IMO to grow out and use in your raised bed mix. Point is, you know what scale you're trying to grow on and what your own goals are. You need to decide if any of these inputs are going to work best for you. Both JADAM and KNF are ways to reconnect your garden with the natural world, something that we too often forget are linked significantly. If you want to dive deeper on how natural farming could transform your garden this year, you'll want to check out this video. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.